welcome to another episode of Game Reviews by James. Today I'll be taking a look at Double Dragon.
The story of Double Dragon is this. A group called the Black Warriors kidnap a girl named Marion. Two martial art experts brothers named Billy and Jimmy must rescue her. That's pretty much it. Note, for this review I'll be looking at the NES version of the game, as well as the Sega Genesis version. We'll start with the NES version of Double Dragon, since this is the version I have less to say about. When I was little, me and my brother played the actual arcade. It was rigged up in such a way that it had unlimited credits, therefore you could never lose, so we cooperatively beat the game. I was a little butthurt when my brother killed me at the end of the game to get the girl, but we had fun nonetheless. So years later, when my dad purchased an NES, we asked if we could get Double Dragon for it. First thing I remember about Double Dragon on the NES was that there wasn't any cooperative two-player mode on it, which is the main reason we liked the arcade version to begin with. There's only this two-player fighting mode, which is okay, but the adventure is what you really play the game for. Aside from that though, the game is actually a very faithful port, and many consider it to be a classic on the NES, seeing as it sold a ton of copies. Going back to this game, I really enjoyed myself. The control feels good and is pretty much entirely intact from its arcade counterpart. Music also sounds good. You obviously can't get the musical tracks from the arcade version on an NES cart, so this is a good alternative. The controls feel a lot more responsive than the arcade version of the game, which is a good thing too, but if you are used to the arcade controls, it can throw you off a little bit. Overall though, I don't have much to say about this version of the game. It's good for one player, but the lack of cooperative two-player mode is a puzzler. I have researched why, and it was just an oversight of the developers and was technically impossible with the way the game was made. The other Double Dragon games on the NES have cooperative two-player mode though. Also puzzling to me is that this game was released on the Wii and Wii U Virtual Console, as well as the Game Boy version being released on the 3DS eShop. I think it would have just been a better idea to port the actual arcade game like they did on the Xbox 360, but oh well, what can you do? Now let's take a look at Double Dragon on the Sega Genesis. This version of the game really looks and feels like the arcade game, which is great. Though being a port of an arcade game, it isn't very long at all. There are 4 missions, or stages, whichever you prefer to call them, and you must travel through them to rescue the girl. If you can do this, the game ends. The first city is a slum, a downtown area where you go through the city fighting off hordes of enemies. The second stage is a factory, which can have you fighting up to 3 enemies at a single time. The third stage is the woods leading up to the final stage, which is the hideout. If you keep your wits about you, this shouldn't actually be very hard to beat. Throughout the game there are items at your disposal. These will help make quick work of the enemies, and they're very satisfying to use. Your player has different attacks. There's punching, kicking, a very limited jump kick combo. Some of these attacks are a little awkward to pull off, and it's very clear that the kick is the definitive way to go. One of the first things I noticed about this version is that it feels way more difficult than either the arcade version of the game or the NES port, but I was really up to the challenge. A big issue I had was enemies teaming up on me. In the one-player mode, this is really difficult to get out of. Like I said earlier, I really like the look of this game. The sprites almost look identical to the arcade, but the music, it's just okay. It had that Sega Genesis gritty feel and it can grind on your ears, so it's best thing to keep the volume down while playing if you're not into it. The control isn't as responsive as I'd like them to be. They're not even as responsive as the arcade version. But seeing as it's almost a perfect replication in other aspects, it's hard to complain about it. Took me a while and a lot of deaths, but I finally made it through the game, and with this version in particular, it felt really great and fulfilling. Rescued Marion and I defeated the Black Warriors. In terms of a port, the Genesis version is the definitive version of the game. Features better graphics and just the feel of the arcade, plus the 2-player cooperative mode is a huge plus for me. The music, well, to be honest, I prefer the NES music, but that is probably the only thing about the NES game I like better. The Genesis version, though, is kinda hard to find nowadays. For one thing, it was released in 1992, which is 3 years after the NES version, so it might not really be as obtainable as the NES version. My recommendation for this game? Well, if you have an Xbox 360, get the arcade version on the store and play that. If you can find the Genesis version, pick it up. If you like the NES, get the NES version. There really is no way to lose here.
Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll check back later for more reviews.